Assalamu alaikum and good evening. On behalf of Muslim Professionals Forum, I would like to welcome all of you for tonight's discussion on prevent strategy, that is mainly focusing on universities titled University Does Prevent, Stop or Stoke Islamophobia. My name is Khaled. I'm by profession, I'm a lawyer, and also I'm a local councillor in Red Beach Council. And I'm the chair of Muslim Professional Forum, and I will be hosting this evening. And also we have a distinguished guest with us. Let me introduce our guest, Sariya Contractor. She is the assistant professor and research lead for faith and peaceful relations at Center for Trust and Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. Sariya Cheruvallil-Contractor, she regards herself as a feminist sociologist in religion. She is current chair of the Muslims in British Research Network, and her research emphasizes collaborative methodologies that works with for research participants to capture the nuisance and complexity of their everyday life experience of religion or belief in British society. She is the author of a number of publications, including Muslim Women in Britain, Demystification of Muslima, published in 2012, Religion or Belief, Discrimination and Equality, Britain in Global Context, published in 2013, Islamic Education in Britain, New Pluralist Paradigms, published in 2015, and lastly, Islam on Campus, Contested Identities and Cultures of Higher Education. Before I invite our guest to present her speech, let me just give you a brief introductions. As you know that in 2011, government published its prevent strategy, and the main objective prevent strategy is to describe by the government prevent guidelines that to aim to prevent strategy to reduce the threat to the UK from terrorism by stopping people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorism. And the three specific strategic objectives has been provided by the guidelines in 2011. That is, respond to the ideological challenge of terrorism and the threat we face from those who promote it, prevent people from being drawn to terrorism and ensure that they are giving appropriate advice and support, and lastly, work with sectors and institutions where there are risks of radicalization that we need to address. And in this regard, as part of the Prevent Strategy Guidelines, in 2015, that is Act Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015, Section 26, given the specific duties to the specific authorities and bodies. And that includes under Section 16, Section 6 or Schedule 6 of this Act, that is schools, including higher education, NHS, and also local authorities and other institutions. So in this regard, we will be focusing today mainly the universities, how this prevents duties and responsibilities put it on as a statutory footing, how the university is coping, whether it is promoting the free speech and or whether it is suppressing in any way of discussion that should be promoted by the universities at their inherent duties, and also whether it is any way encouraging Islamophobia within our campus and education institutions. So before I go further, may I just welcome Dr. Sariya Cheruvallil-Contractor. She will have about 25 to 30 minutes to a presentation, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask the question to her. Those who are watching live on Facebook, you can ask the question, put your comment on Facebook Live. We'll try to pick up some of the questions from there. And hopefully we'll have a discussion about an hour or so. And now I hope that you'll enjoy the discussion. And Dr. Sariya, over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Khalid, for that warm introduction. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. So prevent is something that has, garnered a lot of discourse within the Muslim community and beyond. Does it impede freedoms? Does it make us a safer nation? I mean, those are some of the questions that I'm going to try and interrogate over the next 25 minutes or so. And I'm going to start my presentation now. So hopefully you should be able to see it soon. Please, can you confirm that you can see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. So Brother Khalid just gave us quite a, careful contextualization of what Prevent is. Basically, it was the government's counter-terrorism um, policy that came up in the aftermath of the 7/7 bombings. The government sought to control homegrown terrorism. The critique of Prevent largely, and this comes from a male student, a Muslim student at one of the universities we went to. The critique of Prevent has been that it unfairly targets Muslims, Muslim communities. This particular student says, yes, I understand it's about stopping radicalization. That is true. That should be done. But the policy is mainly targeted for a minority group, for the Muslims. And this person continues, it's not good to target a specific group, bring them under the control of surveillance and to monitor them. I don't think it is fair. That's the critique, that Prevent has not been fair to Muslim communities. But that is something that me and a group of colleagues that I worked with sought to interrogate. In terms of the critique of Prevent, if you look at government figures around, Prevent referrals, clearly in the early part of Prevent, so if you look at it for the year 2015-16, out of the 7,600 people who were referred to Prevent, nearly 5,000 of them were quoted as Islamists. And you see that pattern continues till 2018-19, when you see there is a bit of an evening out now, and similar numbers of Islamist and right-wing referrals. If you then look at the following row on your screen, which is entitled Total Discuss at a channel panel, which is the government's, route to supporting people who are at risk of radicalization, and to you see that out of the 4,000, nearly 5,000 people who were referred as Islamists in 2015, only 800, got referred to a panel, and out of the 800, only 260 received support. So there is clearly, if you look at it over the years, especially in the early years of Prevent, there seemed to be a disproportionate targeting of Muslim communities. Still, that is not evidence. That is clearly not evidence about saying, it tells us, yes, statistically, Muslims are more likely to be referred to Prevent, but does that actually, you know, contribute to Islamophobia? And that is the question that we tried to discuss. And out of, in our AHRC funded Representing Islam on Campus project. This was a 3-year project of rigorous research. We sought to explore how Islam and Muslims were perceived, were interacted with on campus, and how did young Muslims, but also all Muslims who may be staff on a university campus, how did they personally experience their faith as well? Now, we were awarded our grant application in 2015, and that year, the Prevent guidance was changed to make it a statutory duty upon universities, upon schools, upon GPs and local authorities. They were given part of this role of surveillance, and it was made a duty to offer support and to monitor the potential of radicalization in individuals. And this is the backdrop. This wasn't a backdrop we had predicted, but this was the backdrop against which we undertook our research. In this research, we looked at a whole lot of things, but invariably, Prevent became something that came under our lens. Now, I want to very briefly tell you about the team. So we were a team of 6 people: Professor Alison Scott Bauman from SOAS London, Kareem Darwish, who was our coordinator, again from SOAS London, Professor Matthew Guest from Durham, Dr. Shuruk Naguib from Lancaster, and Dr. Aisha Phoenix from SOAS. This was the team. And briefly, again, reflecting on the team, we were a very diverse team, ranging from a white, middle class, non-religious academic straight through to me, who is, of South Asian heritage, and who is both visibly, but also in terms of my personal convictions, deeply committed to the Islamic faith. And I think this positionality within the team enabled us to do, what we did so well. Again, briefly looking at the methodology, we ran a national survey of students distributed across 132 of UK's registered universities. Our sample size was 2,000, so we had 2,022 respondents across a broad range of faiths, of ethnicities, different levels of studies. And we asked them a series of questions to explore their experience of religion on campus, to explore their experiences of Islam on campus, and also to understand who they were, what were they studying. Now, today I'm not going to go into the details of this, the findings of our survey. I'm just going to focus on the question for today around prevent. Now, the survey allowed us, in relation to prevent, allowed us to interrogate the extent of patterns of prejudice against Muslims that we see in wider British culture. How do the patterns that we see in society, what are their ramifications, and how are they exemplified on universities? And secondly, what does this evidence teach us about the capacity of universities to be inclusive spaces, particularly for students of faith? These are the two questions that I'm going to try and focus on today. Now, a survey gives you headline information. So, from our survey, for example, we knew that the majority of Muslim students, nearly 70%, do not stay in halls of residence and go to the university that is closest to their home or in their local area. Now, that's what the survey tells us. But if we want to interrogate what are the reasons why this might be happening, a survey cannot do that. And so, in order to go into the depth of experience, we also undertook qualitative field work. So we visited 6 higher education institutions, of which 4 were universities and 2 were Muslim higher educational institutions. 2 team members from my team spent 2 weeks at each of these campuses. We worked through the student union, we worked through people we trust, and we tried to garner one-to-one interviews and focus group discussions. Now, we spoke to over 300, 400 people. Out of these people, we had interviews and focus group discussions with 253 people. These were people who thought it was important to bear witness to their experiences, to what they had seen on campus, both in relation to good practice as well as in relation to experiences of unfair treatment, prejudice, or discrimination. Our interviews resulted in 140 hours of recorded conversations. And these conversations really go into depth into people's intimate reflections and intimate experiences of campus life. Now, throughout this work, our work was, it was underpinned by an ethical commitment to go beyond, these debates of objectivity and neutrality, an ethical commitment to protect our participants, an ethical commitment also to understand the significance of people who said, look, we support your work, but we do not feel able and comfortable to talk to you on record. So all our campuses, we've kept them anonymous. You can see on your screen some data about the demographic distribution of people we spoke to, and every individual we spoke to as well. We have a very careful process of keeping them anonymous and keeping them safe. But this entire research is underpinned by a duty of care to respondents, to the research team, but also to this nation that we are proud to be part of. Now, going straight then in the interest of time, because I'm going to try and distill a lot of information to you, going straight then into some of the findings. And during the course of the next 10, 15 minutes, I will speak both from the statistics, but then buffer it with, some qualitative detail, some a reflection that is from, intimate to somebody's life. So the first question I want to look at is, how do students view religion on campus? Now, we posed in our survey, we gave our respondents 4 statements to look at. The first statement was, university is a valuable opportunity to develop one's own faith. The second statement, university education is likely to undermine religious faith. Religious groups make a valuable contribution to the life of my university, and universities should incorporate religion and faith into their vision for education. And you will see the maroony color is for students who are of no religion, no religious affiliation. The orange bar is the people who identified as Christian, and the blue bar is the people who identified as Muslims. And you can see clearly the Muslim students, if you look at the first little cluster of bars, they really felt that universities were a valuable opportunity to develop one's faith. They did not see, and going back to the qualitative data, Muslim students did not see this sense of, you know, conflict that some literature, alludes to. There was no conflict between their Britishness and their Muslimness, between their Muslimness and their secularness. They were able to, bring both their religiosity and their non-religiosity in tandem. And you can see this, Muslims more so than other religious groups felt that university was an opportunity to develop their faith. And there is more to reflect on this slide, but I am going to move on quickly. Now, we then posed a series of questions, to a series of statements to our respondents. And I want to firstly ask you to look at the statement, the penultimate statement, which is um, the majority of Muslims are good people. And you can see 87% of students agreed, all students agreed that Muslims are good people. And generally, when you look at all of those screens on your statements, Muslims have made a valuable contribution to British life. Islam is compatible with British values. The majority of Muslims take their moral responsibilities seriously in a way that is a positive example for all people. You can see generally, if you look at the all students box, there is agreement. There is generally positive feeling towards Muslims. When it comes towards statements about Islam, the positivity decreases a little bit. But I'm going to ask you to focus on the last statement at this point. And this was the one statement which was a little problematic. When asked, Islam is a religion that discriminates against women, 42% of all students and 45% of non-Muslim respondents agreed with this question. And this is really interesting because when you look at tropes emerging in the literature around stereotypes of Islam, you see two things stand out. Firstly, that Islam is misogynist and it discriminates against its women. And the other thing that stands out is that Islam is, something that is intolerant towards other faith groups. And it's, in our research, it was particularly strong. Nearly, 45% is just under half of our non-Muslim population. Respondents felt that Islam was a religion that discriminated against women. I'll ask you to hold those thoughts, these statements in your mind, because we'll be coming back to it later. The next thing I wanted to look at is, how is Islam known on campus? What are the sources that people draw on in trying to understand about Islam and Muslims? Now, again, family and friends and schools. Nearly 25% of our sample said that they drew upon their knowledge of Islam either from family and friends or from the school. And that's the second, the last column on your screens, on the right-hand side of your screens. I also want to draw your attention to the last line of this table. Now, in relation to media, the column in the middle of your screen says the percentage who said, it refers, the middle column refers to the source that people draw on for their understanding of religion. The last column refers to the source that people draw on for their understanding of Islam in particular. Now, when it comes to understandings of Islam, nearly 25% of the population said, they draw upon the media. Given that media, a number of research reviews came not from Lancaster, Robin Richardson, from instead a number of research projects, the work that Miqdad Versi at the MCB is doing, a number of research projects indicate that media portrayals of Islam generally tend to, veer towards the negative. and that 25% of our respondents draw upon these negative perceptions to understand Islam is something that is problematic. Again, hold these categories, friends and family and media, in your minds, because we'll be coming back to it later. And this is a quote from our qualitative work from a female Christian student. And she says, yes, I think it, and she's referring to the media, plays a massive role. You can live your whole life and never meet people that are from Islam. I think probably in the local rural areas, there will be people that have never met Black people or who have never met people who are Muslim. So your only opinion would be what you have seen on the media. You just kind of take that as fact and you stick with it. And media put and hold that thought. The media is overwhelmingly something that people are drawing on for their understandings of Islam. Moving on then, prevent. Um, what was the impact of prevent? And so what was its in the everyday dynamics on campuses? So we asked, we via our survey we tried to gauge our respondents understanding of prevent. Nearly 60%, and that's the brown bit on your of the circle on your screen, nearly 60% said I have never heard of prevent. 26% had heard of prevent through media, but not at university. And only a small percentage of people had heard of prevent at university. So again, hold that thought. The majority of people hadn't heard of prevent. However, despite having never heard of prevent, people held an opinion about prevent, including opinions that, so 15% of people who had never heard of prevent felt that it was essential. 25% of people who had never heard of prevent felt it can be helpful but damaging if not implemented sensitively. And with this slide, all I want to bring home is that yes, there was if you look at the last tower on your pillar on your screen, 57.8% of people who had never heard of prevent said they didn't have a view about it. But it is really this first part of the screen towards the left hand side that is concerning, because despite never having heard of it, they had an opinion about it. And we cannot say, because this is a survey, what that opinion might be, but we can still interrogate this a bit further. Now, we asked students in our survey about radicalization and whether it was a problem. The first chart on the left hand side of your screen asked respondents survey responses to the question, in my view, radicalization is a serious problem within UK universities. And you can see there is a good mix. Some people agree that it is a problem, some people disagree. Now, the second chart on your screens is, in my view, radicalization is a serious problem within my university. And overwhelmingly now what you see, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, students either disagree or strongly disagree. So and what we can surmise here is there is this sense from the sources of data that they're drawing upon that radicalization is a problem. But when it comes to their immediate vicinity, when it comes to the people that they are interacting with, they actually disagree that radicalization is a problem. So these fears, these concerns seem to be less about what is their immediate experience and more about media discourse and political discourse and popular discourse around radicalization, prevent, and Islam. Now, this is quite a complicated screen, and it sort of tries to look at patterns that emerge, when we look at people who think radicalization is a problem at the top of your screen, and people at the bottom who think radicalization is not a problem, we now look at how they responded to questions, those 5-6 questions that I showed you previously, that are value statements about Islam and Muslims. Whether Muslims make a valuable contribution to British life, or whether Islam discriminates against women. And you can see a pattern now. Look at the last screen. Look at the last column on your slides. People who believe radicalization is a problem, nearly 59% of them agree that Islam discriminates against women. Whereas that number falls to 35%, among people who think radicalization is not a problem. And that's a pattern that we saw across, all 6 columns here. Similarly, people who think prevent is essential at the top of your screens, bottom of your screens, people who think prevent is damaging, again, looking at the last column. Nearly 60% of people who think prevent is essential think Islam discriminates against women. That number falls to 32% for people who think prevent is damaging. And again, the pattern is repeated across all 6 columns. And so you come to this slide where we've taken just 2 questions. People who agree, the question around people who agree that Islam is a faith that preaches non-intolerance, and people who agree that Islam as a faith discriminates against women. Now, looking at the first statement, Islam as a faith that preaches intolerance, out of all students, 20% agreed with that. But when it comes to people who believe radicalization is a problem and people who believe prevent is a problem, that number goes up to 40%. Similarly, when it comes to perceptions that Islam is the faith that discriminates against women, nearly 60% of people who believe radicalization is a problem, and of students who agree prevent is essential, nearly 60% agree that Islam is the faith that discriminates against women. So what we can surmise from this data is, again, very simply put, those who agree that prevent is essential to protecting the security of universities are significantly more likely to affirm negative views of Islam and of Muslims than those who hold a more moderate or critical view of prevent. And that, I think, starts to answer that question quite clearly around whether prevent stokes or staves off Islamophobia. Because clearly, if you look, Islamophobic attitudes tend to fall into this pattern around Islam being intolerant, Islam being political and prone to radicalization, and Islam being misogynist against women. And you can see here that prevent seems to be a key indicator. So what happens on campus then? And I'm, last few slides, so I'm finishing in hopefully in time, in a couple of minutes. You see an environment, you see a lot of subtle tensions, a lot of subtle tensions on campus between, towards Muslims and towards Islam. But more crucially, you see this climate of prejudice. As a Muslim, and this is from a Bangladeshi male member of staff, he says, as a Muslim, I do feel that subconscious feeling that if I were to grow a beard, I might be targeted. Now, in 2015, Prevent Guidance made this thing about nonviolent extremism. And Muslims feel really under fire. I start wearing a hijab or start wearing a niqab or become a bit more religious. Am I going to be targeted? And that's a really, and people might say, oh, that's a perception, but it's having clear impacts on the mental health, on the well-being of students on campus. So we heard students say that we're not going to access mental health services because if we say something, we might come under prevent. And at least 2 students said to us in this research that we did not draw out particular books from the library because if we drew them out, we might come under prevent radar. And so we asked our white friends to draw the book out for us. There was also examples of evidenced discrimination, name calling, hijab pulling. This young woman voiced some views in class. That's the last quote on your screen. And she said, somebody called her an extremist in class. And that is discriminatory on all levels. And so this British Bangladeshi PhD student tells us there is a general feeling across Muslim communities that while dissent is a very, very strong British tradition, somehow it doesn't apply to Muslims. As soon as Muslims want to say something that dissents from the mainstream, it becomes a shared value issue. Whereas for other people, they can still dissent. And that is a serious concern because what we are seeing happening, conversations are getting closed down in classrooms, in the college square, and actually as universities are microcosms of society, in society as well. And this student says prevent is a disaster. Essentially, for me, it's a form of state sponsored social engineering of the Muslim community to make it something that it understands. It ethnicizes us in some weird way. Whereas Muslims are diverse ethnicities, diverse ways of believing, diverse ways of practicing Islam, and Prevent almost tries to do this broad brush issue, sweeping of Muslims into one category. However, it's not all doom and gloom. And I always like to say this, if universities are meant to be, you know, spaces of education and of creating citizens, this is still happening. So this African male student, he tells us, how before meeting Muslims, he was very scared of them. And then he goes on campus and he realizes that his roommate is going to be a Muslim, and he was really, really worried. But then he met his Muslim housemate and he said, meeting with him and talking to him about Islam, because he was quite open, it probably changed my belief about Muslims. So I think it really cooled my previous perception that Islam is, you know, everyone associates Islam with terrorism. But for me right now, I've seen Islam in a different way, as a uniting factor, as a common denominator between people. And he could see how Islam, for his Muslim roommate and for all his Muslim friends, Islam was something that they drew their moral values from, and their life lessons from. And what we found in our research, that these personal encounters that were informal were the most powerful in challenging Prevent, in challenging radicalization, in challenging the stereotyping of Islam and Muslims. So we make some recommendations to university sectors, but also to Muslim community leaders. We ask universities to create spaces where the power of voice can exist freely in classrooms, in interfaith, in chaplaincies in universities, in digital spaces, but to allow students and staff to come together and to share, their diverse experiences and to grow, through these experiences. But also the power to voice freely, to challenge, discourses such as Prevent that are closing down these free spaces. These spaces will then, and this power to voice will create spaces for dialogue and for intercultural exchange. That, when it comes to challenging stereotypes and creating citizens in our research, was the most powerful. And I haven't gone into, the politics of dialogue today at all. And finally, there is this recommendation around expanding Islamic studies, because when we went to Muslim colleges where students were studying Islamic studies hardcore, we also saw this confidence among these young people and this desire to become dialogians and to challenge tropes of, you know, stereotypes, but also to challenge, radical narratives of Islam where they existed. And these are Muslim students saying, look, we're going to represent Islam in a way that is rooted in the text. And finally, then a brief thoughts around Prevent. Well, in its current form, Prevent is clearly closing down conversations. Our statistics have shown that. Prevent is also clearly strengthening, the normative stereotypes of Islam as a religion that, discriminates against women, that is intolerant. And so rather than curb radicalization, it is serving solely, it looks like from our statistics, to further alienate and further marginalize voices who should be included, Muslim voices who should be included. So that's it from me. There are further resources if you want to interrogate the statistics. If you want to read more about our findings, we've got a book as well. The book is quite expensive, so ask your local libraries to buy it, but the report is freely downloadable. And do follow me on Twitter if you also want to ask me further questions about it. That's it from me. I'm going to put the slides off, and I'm open to conversations. So hopefully I'm back on your screens now properly. We can't hear you, Brother Khalid.
Unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I was saying thank you very much for your eloquent presentation and lots of information there, lots of information and statistics. And I must say that the picture you have painted, I think so adequately painted the full picture. But we'll ask a few questions as well to identify and ascertain some of the points as well. But my understanding is from the statistical data and what I study as well from your work in the before I come on this show as well. So I print out some of the information as well that is widely available in online and government resources as well in regards to prevent strategies. But my first question to you, because what is really in contest that is the government counter terrorism strategy that is published in 2011, giving the three strategical objectives. One of the things will always come to this mind and discussion about the one individual is suspect of being vulnerable to radicalization can be referred to police for further assessment. So, what is really vulnerability? What is your understanding as a researcher, as an academic? Because this something, this word is vulnerability. How do you identify vulnerability? And what is the science of vulnerability that can be addressed or looked into by somebody by police or university authorities? That is obviously they have to look into it at the moment because of Section 26 of the Terrorism and Security Act.
Mm. So thank you for that, Khalid. And this is something I've looked at, and let me give you my answer anecdotally. I spoke to an imam, one of my interviews, and he said to me, he noticed that there were young people, not students, there were young people in his area who were vulnerable. And he said the issue was there is still, there is gang culture in Muslim communities, just as there is gang culture in mainstream communities. There are issues around drug abuse, there are issues around substance abuse. And when it comes to vulnerability, and if you look at the profile of people who commit acts of terror, there is already some criminal leaning, a criminal background. There are issues perhaps around violence, and I think these people who indulge in acts of terror, so-called Islamist acts of terror, are doing it as criminals. They are doing it as people who are vulnerable because of their own background histories with criminality. And what we found in our work was when it comes to core Islamic narratives, when you go back to the foundational texts, when you go back to understandings of Islam that are reasoned, that are literate, there is no space for random acts of violence. And so I think with the police, you've got, and with looking at vulnerability, you have to look at criminal inclinations and a propensity perhaps to commit an act of violence that has actually nothing to do with Islam.
Well, thank you. I just print out a report from published in Guardian on 6th of October 2019.
Mhm.
This giving the statistics, and between 2017 2018, a total of 7,318 individuals were subject to referral, but
Yep.
only 394 were escalated to the channel process.
Yes.
And another report published on the same newspaper, I think so, in 2019 January as well, and is mentioned that categorically that often 394 people who were received channel support in 2018 and 17 and 18, 179, that means 45%, had been referred to concern related to Islamist extremism, and 174, that is 44%, of concern related to right-wing extremism.
Mm.
So the data showing that on percentage those are referred is about 50-50. Do you see that both are concern has been taken seriously as in compared to in ratio, or it is
Yeah.
just going to in one hand, one-sided, this focusing the Muslim community and Muslim youth? What is
Well,
your observation on this?
yeah. Thank you. So I put up a screen, didn't I, earlier on in my presentation that looked at specifically at those statistics. And clearly in the early part of Prevent. So if you look at these statistics for 2015-16, for 16-17, for 17-18, you see that Muslim referrals are nearly 2.5 times 3 times and 4 times the referrals for right wing extremists. It's only in 2018-19 that you begin to see this evening out, and you see a 50-50% stance in relation to referrals, but also then in relation to who is given support via channel. And I think part of this is due to the attentiveness, the lobbying of Muslim communities, of people who support Muslim communities, but people who understand Islam in general. So you see a lot of ad hoc, targeting of Muslim communities to start with. But then I think over the years, with a little bit of lobbying, with work such as this research and other research projects, but also I think the increased recognition of the threat of right wing extremism, there has been this lobbying. But clearly, if you look at the early part, and also if you look at some of the documents that are published in relation to prevent guidance, there is this overarching emphasis on Muslim communities, and that needs to be challenged. So, I remember reading this document that said, what is nonviolent extremism? It was a presentation I attended. There was this thing that if a young woman suddenly starts wearing a hijab or a niqab, or a young man grows a beard, that might be an indication of nonviolent extremism. And that is worrying. These today, I know I've presented findings in relation to the university sector, but there have been similar, there is similar anecdotal evidence in relation to the school sector, in relation to looked after children. There is this case where a woman who was wearing a niqab. She was a convert to Islam. She wore a niqab. She um, was quite a strict Muslim, and so asked for her child to be withdrawn from her school's Christmas concert. She ended up getting referred, to her local authority, possibly under prevent, and then had to defend herself. When it was investigated, it was agreed that no, actually, she wasn't at threat of radicalization at all, and the school was mistaken. So that is the concern, that because of the markers of what radicalization is, because of the media, because of policy discourse, there is a concern and there is evidence that Islam is unfairly targeted.
Well, thank you for this answer. I just wanted to, on this regard, just as about the perception and the interrogation and how this school is involved. There's a report published in 2019. They said that an 8-year-old boy was questioned by Prevent after his teachers mistook his T-shirt slogan for Islamic State propaganda. A 17-year-old referred because he wore a Free Palestine badge to his school. What is your understand? This somebody is raising a profile, or sorry, or just raising like a Free Palestine and propagating the rights for the people are Palestinian territories. Is this something that is Prevent is focusing, or that is going over the step to the freedom of speech?
So so let's take a step back and think about, how much people, when we in our, where people are drawing their knowledge of Islam from. Now, I'm just trying to pick out the right statistic, but when we asked people about how much they know about Islam, nearly a significant proportion, quite a significant proportion of people said, we don't really know much about Islam. And I'm trying to pick out the statistic and I can't find it, which is typical. But a significant proportion of people said, we don't really know too much about Islam. And it was the Muslim students obviously said, yeah, we know a lot about Islam. But everybody else said, look, we don't really know much. And then when we asked people, where are you drawing your knowledge of Islam from? 25% said that we draw it from our families and friends. Um, Another 25% said from school, but then another 25% said that we are drawing our knowledge of Islam from the media. Now, at one part of the research that I couldn't talk about today was the impact of these different sources of knowledge of Islam, and how it shapes how people know Islam. Now, when people know Islam through their family, through their friends, through their roommates, like that quote I put up on the screen about somebody who thought Muslims were terrorists till he met a Muslim and then realized, oh, actually they're good people. when people draw their knowledge of Islam from, you know, other people they know, from one-to-one conversations, they get a view of Islam that is rooted in everyday real life, and that says, oh, actually these Muslims are like me. She might wear a headscarf, or he might grow a beard, or he might just have a Muslim name but is not religious at all. So these are people like me. They are people like us. They have families, and they get hungry, and they all want to do well at university. But when they get their knowledge of Islam from the media, and from sources that they cannot interrogate, if the media says, oh, so and such a big proportion, all of these Muslim men, Pakistani Muslim men, are part of grooming gangs. If that's the message they're getting from the media, they don't have the opportunity to ask follow-up questions. And so if the media discourse is largely negative, that shapes what people think about Islam and Muslims. And it might lead them to think that, oh, you know, Free Palestine badge. Oh, that's scary. They might be wanting to go and do jihad in Palestine. And it scares people. And that is what, as a community, I think we have a responsibility to challenge that through our actions and words. And coming back to this whole thing around freedom of expression and speech, absolutely, there seems to be, according to the Muslim respondents to our survey and in our data, in our qualitative data, there seems to be a different yardstick. If a Muslim wants to dissent, it's dangerous. If a Muslim wants to participate in, Free Palestine or whatever, it is viewed with further suspicion than, say, a white Christian student. And again, there is a responsibility on civil society as a whole to interrogate, has our we are a liberal society, but has our liberal turn gone to the right, so that anybody who disagrees with liberal views is viewed with suspicion? And I think we've got to interrogate that philosophically, but also conversationally.
Well, thank you. I just come to this another issue that is mainly focusing on university campus about the Muslim association or societies, the inviting speakers. That is one of the guidance, obviously, the under 2015 Act, Section 25, giving the power to Secretary of State to issue the guidance for the higher education institutions. One of the guidance was challenged in the court of law. And in 2019, probably you heard of that Court of Appeal found that previous guidelines on inviting controversial speakers and violate freedom of speech. And then court say, I just quote in here, we do not intend to attempt to redact the paragraph 11, since that it is a matter for the government. And judge said, we do not, however, consider that a balanced guidance which better reflects what perceived the Secretary of State intended is to say would be very easily achievable. And my understanding is the government issued another revised guidelines in April 2019 is clearly say in paragraph 11, the furthermore, when deciding whether or not to be a particular speaker, should consideration carefully whether the views being expressed or likely being to be expressed constitute extremist view that risks drawing people into terrorism or shared by terrorist groups. Is a big burden, isn't it, on universities authorities, isn't it? Because how can a judge who is coming and what is going to say, and how we can perceive in this regard that whether it is promoting, because you just putting a bar is an artificial bar in there, uh, like a holistic bar that you should be not inviting them or giving them any platform.
Mm. I mean, it has put inordinate emphasis on, and an inordinate responsibility on universities. And I mean, more than, and it's bureaucratically, it's a huge task. But even more than that, I mean, I think I'll say two things on this, because, one, we went to 6 universities, we surveyed a lot of people, we found no evidence of extremist speakers. There have been issues, though. There has been issues where far right speakers have been banned. A feminist speaker was there was a lot of hoo-ha around a feminist speaker, as well as a number of Muslim speakers, because But what I will say is two things, and this is what I always say in response to this question. Firstly, who is a terrorist and who is, who holds an extremist view? Both Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi and Nelson Mandela were at one time described as terrorist individuals in British government policy documents. We know that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi is the father of nonviolence and the known to be the father of peace studies, and Nelson Mandela was a peace laureate, Nobel Peace Laureate. So that's A. But two, and this comes to me from an elderly Sikh gentleman, and he said, yes, we're very easy and quick to talk about our freedoms, the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression. And we talk about our human rights in relation to freedom of speech and expression, but there is also human responsibility. And yes, there are speakers who are problematic, and there are speakers who say things that might offend. And this is in relation to a whole load of freedom of expression, freedom of speech issues. While there is a space to say what you want to say, there is also a space to defend views and values that are righteous. And there is indeed the responsibility not to, well, deeply offend. And it's a big debate. It's a big philosophical debate. But I just urge caution in all of this because, yeah, we don't want to become a nation where our freedoms are curbed. We've seen that happens in Turkey, in India, in many, many parts of the world. And we are a country that pride ourselves on our right to dissent. That's a great British tradition, and we need to celebrate it.
Thank you for long answer. I'm just trying to focus the timing as well. I think so. We have about 10 minutes time now.
Okay.
So I have a few more questions to just consider and ask the question to you. One of the criticism of the prevent is mainly focusing on its effectiveness and how we measure the effectiveness of the prevent strategy and standard practice. And this is one of the core concerns also raised by the Muslim Council of Britain in their presentation as well. And in this regard, and after all this criticism in 2019, I think so, security ministers then agreed to review the prevent strategy. And on this regard, under the Counterterrorism and Border Security Act 2019, the government committed to carrying out a implementation review of the prevent.
Yeah.
And government initially recruited the Lord Caroline to review this the prevent strategy, though I think my understanding is resigned in 2019 December. No longer at the moment is pushed. I think so it's Beckett now. One of the objectives is given for the review is to how effective is statutory prevent duty and how effectively it is being implemented. What do you think in here should be looked into seriously? What is your understanding that you can give 2-3 ideas that could be looked into seriously? And in terms of the effectiveness and your overall outlook in here as well. I'm just asking two different questions.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of Prevent and the university, I mean, what we find Prevent has done, it has caused significant harm by reinforcing common stereotypes of Islam and Muslims, but also caused significant harm by curbing freedoms of speech and expression on campus. And because and we see this curbing of freedoms of expression and speech taking place more widely in British Muslim society. And this is and so in reviewing Prevent, I think what they need to look at is how this can be challenged. There is no point in trying to stop radicalization. You cannot stop radicalization by further marginalizing a community, by further throwing a community, pushing it into a corner, and by actually closing down the very roots, the very pathways to conversation that allow, free interrogation of this flawed policy. So we are in a catch-22 situation where we've got a flawed policy but can't interrogate it because the policy doesn't let us do it. So I think that is the review. By we need to stop the vilification and the alienation of Muslims. And by strengthening, ties and bonds of communication with Muslim communities, that's how you target radicalization. We found in our work that Islamic studies was quite a powerful antidote to radical narratives. So, if you want to challenge radicalization, you work with core Islamic studies. You work with people who actually know Islam and spread those understandings of Islam in communities. So, I think that's how I answer your what this review needs to do. This review needs to again open up a fair, open conversation about prevent, and the government needs to build really robust and meaningful partnerships with Muslim communities that exist outside of the securitization, radicalization narrative.
Well, I think so. You're right in here. I think so. When it's a government minister announced that they will review, the from Muslim Council of Britain, they just clearly mentioned that any review must have independent credibility and trust required to deliver it. And the trust, I think so. My understanding is that focusing for last 5-6 years on this issue and debate. Do you think government able to restore trust regarding the prevent? Because obviously I think so you're fully aware of the like a toxic brand, toxic prevent by Dalbabu mentioned in 2015, I understand. Do you think this trust can be regained while this prevent is the moment how we can see?
Well, without a serious, really serious review of Prevent, with a clear, interrogation of its assumptions, and with also, I think what we need in this review is transparency. Who are the Muslim organizations you are working with and why? Who is drawing down funding under Prevent, and why? Are there, there was this big hoo-ha a few years ago when there were CCTVs everywhere in Sparkbrook, in Birmingham. Those are the things that need to be challenged. You can and so I guess there is a lot that the British government does well. And every time I speak to British Muslim communities, they talk about how much more rights they have here as compared to, say, France or America, even as compared to some Muslim majority places. So, young people tell me if they grew up in Iran or in Pakistan, perhaps they would not have had the opportunities to engage with their faith critically and carefully and to reflect on their faith as much as they do here. So, in many ways, I think there is this sense of, we are safe and protected in Britain. The Muslim community is seen as a valued part of British society. But Prevent is a toxic brand. Under Prevent, there's been all sorts of dealings that have been, where, there was this recent, all sorts of dealings that have to be interrogated. And so I think trust can be restored, but that is me being very optimistic. I think if you were to speak to my other colleagues, they would say, no, it is difficult. But I will say trust can be restored, even on university campuses. The dialogue was really powerful. People wanted to know Islam and Muslims, and the majority of people in our survey said Muslims were good people. So I think trust can be restored, but only with an open and transparent and clear review of Prevent, because in its current format, we think it is untenable and needs to be discontinued.
Well, thank you very much for this your answer. I'm just coming to close our discussion, but obviously few small question I have before I conclude. In one of your article, you mentioned about a very important issue is decolonizing our curriculum. And how do you see in this recent the Black Lives Matters movement, and in terms of prevent strategy, that is obviously we have a concern about it is disproportionately affected the Muslim youth or students.
Yes.
Do you think that we are heading toward the right direction about the recolonizing our curriculum? Because you mentioned,
Decolonizing.
yeah,
Decolonizing.
decolonizing, yes.
Got me. Got me. Okay.
Yeah, okay, yes, yeah.
So absolutely, what we need, the decolonizing movement or I prefer to call it, the movement that interrogates the hierarchies of knowledge. And I'm going to get a little academic here. What we see in all of knowledge, if you look at our philosophy, if you look at our sociology, it is very Eurocentric. When you look at sociology, we go back to Durkheim and Marx. We do not go back to Ibn Khaldun, who way before Durkheim and Marx defined and studied society in a sociological framework. So our processes of knowledge, um, our makers of knowledge are still very Eurocentric, they are very white, and they are very middle class. And we need to move away from this to interrogate, because knowledge is power. Foucault said that, you know the Quran says that, men of understanding. So knowledge is power. And if at the moment the way, if you look at the balance of this power, is very much aligned to a particular voice that stems from the colonial world, and we are saying we need to hear more voices that are black, that are female, that are Muslim, that are women, and to hear their perspectives of knowledge. Let me give you a very, you know, a potent example. Now, a few of you will have heard of Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh was an Indian freedom fighter, who who threw a bomb and ended up killing a British governor's wife and daughter. And I'm using a historical example because it's easier to talk about these things with some distance. Now, all British documents refer to Bhagat Singh as a terrorist, extremist of the highest degree. All Indian documents, there has been big Bollywood blockbuster movies, talk about him as a hero who did some killing and then who was then hung without a fair trial by the British. The truth is somewhere in between, and we need to hear voices. So when you at the moment, if you look at curricula, it is very much one story. We need to hear all of these stories to understand the power hierarchies that determine knowledge. Was that too academic and too vague?
No, no, it's fine. I think so. You bring up about the issue about the Ibn Khaldun. And I
Mm.
think so your understanding and my understanding, I was a student of sociology as well. So I understand the Ibn Khaldun and his contribution. The ironically is it is the problematic as well of the Muslim community as well. When I study the honors in sociology, I never heard of Ibn Khaldun. I
Mm,
only heard of Ibn Khaldun when coming here in the 20 years ago. And then I study myself. And
exactly.
I ask myself, how I on earth I complete masters without Ibn Khaldun. And he
Exactly.
effectively, he is the founder and father of sociology. Because his term Asabiya still is discussed everywhere. Wherever talk
Exactly.
about wherever talk nationalism, extremism, everything, because term has been given in wide definition. So I think so you are fully on the mark on this matter. But let me just come to end as well the final few questions. One is about the obviously we want to see that university is functioning as now functioning, but we want to see that it is safe space for everyone student and those are coming for their academic endeavor and to obviously come out with intellectual mind asking difficult and critical question. And one of the writer is her name is Alison Jamieson, I think so, and she authored a book Radicalization and Terrorism, a teacher's handbook for addressing extremism, and she recommended the creation of safe spaces that might encourage classroom discussion of political violence and terminology of terrorism and peacemaking through conflict resolution. How we can create this atmosphere in this
So,
environment?
So at the moment, our universities are being pulled in a few directions. So they are being pulled by this whole prevent duty, and there's this securitization being taken place. Universities are also becoming big business, and they are becoming so. One of my colleagues likes to call them big coffee houses, because students become consumers rather than the sacred act of sharing knowledge. Now, in our research, two things. One, we've already discussed decolonization. And so, in our findings, we talk about when talking about Islam, when talking about community spaces within the curricula, we need to have a bent towards decolonizing curricula. So we need to include more educators, more texts, more frameworks, and more methodologies that are not Eurocentric. We also need to think about the wider community spaces within the university, because people live on universities in halls of residence. They have social gatherings there, and from a pedagogical point of view, this whole idea of safe space is really important. Now, when students got together, right, as students, now they're not they we noticed that they were able to leave some of their cultural baggage behind, and so they were not Muslims or Christians or Black African Caribbean Pentecostals. They were just students. They were all engineers or they were all sociologists. And that is really powerful. They were able to create a shared sense of identity, within which, then again, going back, they were able to say, oh, actually, he's an engineer like me, but he's Muslim and he's okay. And pedagogically, I think in the ways that we teach, but also structurally in the spaces that we create within universities. So, this might be time spaces, so space between lectures for group work. This might be physical spaces in the classroom, in the coffee house, in the cafeteria. These might be webby spaces. These might also be intellectual spaces. We need to create all of these different worldviews to come together. And we can do it quite easily through group work and through proper engineering. But we need the sharing of cultures. This idea of exchange is really important.
I think that's very nice. In terms of the last point you make, this is my final question to you before I hear your final thought. Those students now at the moment, those are also hearing or they might hear your discussion and they go into university, the student, those are fear about the prevent and their freedom of speech as well. What is your advice to them?
Um, it's quite a difficult question, this last one. One, we see on, young Muslim students there is this responsibility that society has shouldered on them to be representatives of their faith. Some people like that responsibility and they flourish under it, and they can talk about Islam and Muslims and demystify Islam and themselves and talk about terrorism. But others may not like that, and others shy away from this responsibility. So the first thing I will tell students is, just be yourself. Don't feel that you have to be something that you're not because society expects it of you. Just be yourself. Two, in relation to prevent, I'll go back to the statistic that says the vast majority of students on campus, nearly 80%, felt that Muslims were good people, felt that Islam was a faith that gives you moral values, moral understanding, and that Muslims, were good moral human beings. Focus on the good bit. If you do find yourself, but also at the same time, I will say, get to know your Islamic society, get to know your student union, because student unions are extremely helpful and are at the front, of challenge, of prevent. And after that, once you've got your safety network that you can fall on, get to know your family, get to know significantly reporting mechanisms within your university to report unfair treatment and discrimination. And after that, just be yourself, because that's the best you can be. I can't hear you, sir.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and excellent question answer session and your all thought-provoking answers as well, especially the final one. I just to ask you to share your final thought, and in this final thought, I'll ask you to focus as well. You mentioned about the media stereotyping and media narrative about the Muslim and women as well. And in this your discussion and context, because lots of things is appeared to be, and also evidence based as well, is media narrative. How we can come out from this media narrative and address at least the media understand. I would say that you will conclude on this point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's actually been great being here. So, in relation to the media, I think there are different ways through which we could challenge it, and one is through the large policy level, through the academic research that we are doing, through the policy lobbying that I know lots of Muslim organizations are doing, through the work that the MCB and people like the Center for Media Research, Migdad Versi and company are doing, to be vigilant, of negative media stereotyping and to challenge that. Um, so the first challenge is on policy level. The second challenge is on this vigilance. But then the third challenge, and this in our both in our qualitative work, which was people's stories and people's worldviews, as well as the statistics, the most powerful challenge. So I know I said 25% of people got their understandings of Islam from media, but another 25% said that they got their understandings of Islam from friends and family and from schools. And this friends and family is the personal encounter between family, between friends on campus, between two young people, studying on the same course. Two young people, one who is Muslim, one who is not. Both of them are on the course because they want to do well. They want to get a good degree, or get a first class or whatever, and then go on to establish a secure career and earn their livelihood. So these two young people, one Muslim and one non-Muslim, if they get to know each other and if they focus on what they share, the bridge building is immensely powerful. And um, both data sets were unanimous on the power of personal encounter to challenge stereotypes and the power of personal encounter to build bridges. So I think we can do the policy level challenge and the academic level challenge, but we also need to have these friendships and these discussions every day on the bus to university, in our classrooms, in the cafeteria, and more such conversations will ultimately challenge the stereotypes. But it is a big responsibility.
Well, Sariya, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and your final thought as well. And you are excellent, I must say that, because it is very difficult subject. We try our best. Those are watching on the Facebook Live, and they might watch in later on as well, because this video will be available on our website for foreseeable future. So you will have the opportunity to watch and make your comment there. We are unable to make any pick up any point from the Facebook because the time shortage, but still you can share your thoughts and opinion there. We'll try to understand and try to share with our speaker as well. And this subject, though, is very difficult and also is a controversial subject, but it is an act of parliament and the law is passed by the parliament. Obviously, we all have to adhere the law, but we expect that what our speaker said, that government will look in this matter seriously to way that is building trust between our communities, especially the Muslim communities, because my understanding trust has been broken, and it is very difficult challenge for the government and security services and also government authorities as well. Final things I want to say that we are coming to end of this year, and those are at the moment in university, already probably going to university with their families. Stay safe, and those expecting to visit their family member during the window of during the Christmas holiday, please stay safe. Try your best to keep your relatives and yourself safe, and hope you will have a happy holiday. And we expect that we want to see our next next year session, that is 2021 January. We will be hoping to discuss about the institutional racism and Islamophobia. Until that point, and thank you very much for watching. If we make any unintentional comment that shouldn't be making, or anything you find offensive, please excuse us, because our objective was to discuss and share ideas and knowledge and provide the platform the professionals to share their views. So with this note, thank you very much. Have a lovely evening. Good night. Assalamu alaikum.